The sky so far, but I can't lose it.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Talking Tent, a RaceSpotTV podcast. Thank you for joining us, either live across RaceSpot social media channels or through the audio version released on a podcast app of your preference the very same day. Slight change today. My name is Arjuna Kankipati and I am joined by esports correspondent Soumil Arora. Usually it would be Connery Maddock and Hugo Luis alongside, but instead they've left me in charge to push the buttons and talk today. So hopefully this all goes well. We'll be joined by Turner Motorsports driver Robby Foley to investigate zebraing in just a little bit, but Soumil, a big day yesterday, one of the 4 Christmases we get on the iRacing service, Build Day. Some new tracks, some new cars, and some surprises that were in store for what I feel was a very well-rounded build to kick off a new season.
Oh, absolutely. What a big surprise this was. I mean, coming in, we all expected all the new tracks, all the new cars to come in, but the way it has panned out, everyone's just had really positive reviews. I mean, my Twitter feed has been completely filled up with everyone in the sim racing community posting out fun videos of the new tracks, of the new cars. Everyone's just having a good time, and let's be honest, at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do for.
So, Hockenheim, obviously on the road side. Then you got some dirt tracks as well, the Catalunya RX track, one of my new favorites to drive. But then, of course, we don't know how much we want to talk about this song, but GT4s, there was some speculation about a new car being dropped on the iRacing service. And guess what? We didn't get the car itself, but the template made its way out. The McLaren 570S GT4 car coming to the iRacing service.
Now, this is something that we've been advocating for a very long time on RaceSpotTV. I mean, we just need more GT4 cars and DCRs, but that's a separate debate altogether. But it's so much fun to see, right? I mean, only I think a couple of months ago, not a couple of months, but around half a year ago, we only had the Porsche GT4s. It was looking like a very, very weak field. Then you had the BMWs, and then all of a sudden, oh wow, look at this, a McLaren's on its way as well. All of a sudden, the series, they should be really interesting. All the endurance championships that we're going to have. I'm pumped to see how this goes.
And we're also now with 3 GT4 cars, BOP will start to become a factor. Some of the other things though, some more maintenance things if you will. A couple of things for broadcasters, replay compression for audio. Some sounds are now sounding absolutely incredible. But I think the thing that gets me most excited, Soumil, is the fact that we have this increased communication, release notes getting published before build day. The forums are up while the update is going on. There's so many exciting things that while it might not be the biggest in terms of content this build, it does set us up for 2 more very big builds later this year where there is some content that we know is in the pipeline.
Yeah, exactly. It's really fun to see iRacing doing this sort of stuff, right? Having all the build notes available for everyone. Now, usually companies would push this off inside into some newsletter that nobody's ever going to read, but iRacing, they've just gone a different route altogether. They've had it on the website, it's available in all the different forums, and I love doing that. Whenever the build comes in, right? Sitting down on the website, checking, this is interesting, this is interesting, this is nice, this should be an even fun thing to watch out for, and that actually makes me very excited to see how things are actually going to be for the next few odd months until we get the next build.
And it's a relatively quiet week on RaceSpot, week 13, so lots of fun for you guys to go out and do. But of course, next week we'll kick off a new season. Lots of official coverage as well. We've got the IndyCar Series. We've also got the Indy Pro 2000, and yet to be confirmed exactly what Friday night primetime is going to be. But very much looking forward to that. So, quick little recap then of Christmas yesterday for a lot of people. It was a rather excited day when that McLaren paint template got dropped. But let's dive straight into it then and introduce our guest for today, Robby Foley, Turner Motorsports driver with a very interesting backstory. And he'll be competing in just over a week's time at the IMSA 12 Hours of Sebring. He'll also be racing, though, in the Michelin Pilot Challenge race as well. And that's why we're going to talk to him. We're going to investigate Sebring. So, Robby, delighted to have you on the podcast. I'm sure you must be excited now about the second race of your real-life racing year.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Yeah, as you say, we have our two biggest races basically right off the bat. First with Daytona and now Sebring. Different challenge for sure with Sebring than Daytona, but looking forward to it.
And so, Robby, let's kind of split this up into two. We'll start with your real-life background and then talk a little bit about the sim as well. So, for those who don't necessarily know, when I was doing some research, I had to read a rather graphic description of an injury that you suffered. Racing wasn't always your first love. At the age of 14, you were in a high school football game, a very unfortunate injury that left you with some significant trauma to deal with. It took a year before you were up and running in terms of just even walking again. But from that, this passion for race cars kind of grew and developed. And now this career has really blossomed as well.
Yeah, I would say racing for sure was always my passion, but I never thought it was something I could really attain. Yeah, without getting into too much disgusting detail, I had a really bad leg injury. I tore all the ligaments in my knee, broke all the bones in my leg, apart from my femur, and ended up with some nasty nerve damage. So I basically didn't walk for just over a year and had a lot of rehab process and recovery process. But it gave me a lot of motivation. I thought I was going to play football and baseball maybe into college, but yeah, I just basically made a deal with my dad. If I got good enough grades, he would kind of help me start my racing career with Skip Barber. And yeah, at that time they had a scholarship system where if you won at the entry level, they would pay for your next level, which was great for me. And basically I used that over the 3-4 years I was in the program to kind of launch my career.
And so kind of talking a bit before then, because of course you talk about those aspirations to play other sports. Doing some more research, your dad was very much your inspiration to get into car racing and autocross as it was back then. What were some of the big influences that you can remember? And for me, I remember the one pass that got me into Formula One, and it was Michael Schumacher, Mika Häkkinen at Spa, splitting a lapped car down into Le Comps. I can remember it vividly, just like I was there watching it 21 years ago. So do you remember these kind of moments that have really ingratiated yourself into this community?
Yeah, I would say, so my dad was in autocrossing, which is you're racing against the time clock through an autocross course set up by cones, but I can remember vividly being very young and sitting in my, whatever you call it, high chair or you know, little kid's chair when I was maybe 5-6 years old and just watching him work on the car. And then, yeah, I would travel basically to these events, and eventually I started taking part in go-karts. But I just always remembered like the sounds, the noises, the smells. I used to go and watch at Lime Rock all the professional races that would happen. Lime Rock was 2 hours from my house. So yeah, for me, it was just everything I loved to do. I always watched racing on the weekends. And yeah, it was my passion. I basically would eat, sleep and breathe it, but it was not something I thought I could do. It was like for me being an astronaut or a firefighter as a kid, or just something that was, just such a dream that you don't always expect to be able to chase after it, if that makes sense.
And Robby, what's really interesting is that I read about you that you often used to sneak down in the nights and used to watch the races while they were going on, while your family was asleep.
Yeah.
It must have been, I mean, it must have felt like racing is something really far apart, right? And since then,
Yeah.
seeing those steps materialize one after the other, do you ever step back, look at it and say, wow, this is a big body of work that I've accumulated in the last few years?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my favorite race growing up was always Le Mans, and like you say, I would always fake it to my mom that I was going to sleep, and I would go in my room, basically wait till I figured she was asleep, and then I would go back downstairs, turn the TV on. Then the next morning I would be asleep on the couch, and I would be in a lot of trouble. But anyway, yeah, it's been an interesting journey, just in the fact that, yeah, when you see the sport as, you see it from a different viewpoint when you're a fan than you do as someone who's taking part in it. But I definitely felt, from where I am now, looking back where I was as a kid as a fan, it felt very, very far away. You take some of that for granted in the years that you're getting to this point, because you're just trying as hard as you can. It's definitely a grind in that respect, but yeah, I feel very fortunate and lucky to have been able to sort of live out my dreams, and compete in races that I, would watch at 8 years old on the couch through the night at Daytona, watch Sebring, all these big races, racing against people that I watched growing up. So it's been a great humbling experience, and something I have to pinch myself for every day, for sure.
Robby, what was life like back in New Jersey, right? I mean, you mentioned that you used to play many other sports as well. Where does that athletic ability come from? Or where does that athletic passion or that seed really come from you? Is it something that's been a part of your family for a long time?
Not directly. I think a lot of it was my friends growing up and who I was involved with, maybe. There was a big sports community where I grew up, and I always enjoyed the competition. I went through phases of being really into it and really competitive, and then went through more casual phases. But I would say by the time I was 12, 13, I was definitely playing baseball and football as much as I could and very serious about it. But I think part of it was the community aspect. The competition was a big thing as well. And just trying to get the best out of yourself, I think, is something that I really enjoy. And to be honest, something I've definitely learned a lot about myself through racing. And if I look back and think about when I was playing football as a kid, like things I could have done so much better, because you just learn how to eventually get the best out of yourself. So I think those are all aspects, and really just enjoying right now, I would just say enjoying getting the best out of myself.
Well, and one thing, Robby, that I think is unique about you in this world of professional race car drivers, especially in sports car racing, is you talked about winning that Mazda scholarship, and the same year that you used that money in 2016 to step up to that next level of competition, you also then went off to start the next portion of your career and life, which was pursuing a mechanical engineering degree at the Auburn University. And I do want to ask you about that from two different perspectives, because one, I think the knowledge that you will gain from a course like that must have helped you as a race car driver, just from a process point of view. But secondly, a Formula SAE, Auburn has a very good team, and I know from talking to other people in the sim racing community just how important that program can be to develop them as well. So why did you think college was so important, and how much of a struggle was it for you to try and balance the commitments of trying to make it as a professional racing driver versus, like we talked about before you came on air, that risk versus reward of always knowing that professional race car driver, it's not a guaranteed thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think from my parents growing up, they never pushed me to pursue racing because they knew the realities of it. They obviously knew that I had a passion for it and support me in every way doing it, but I always was very realistic growing up. So I think from their point of view, I was always going to need to go to college, and I don't regret that, and I agree in a lot of ways. I think it's it's a good foundation, like you sort of mentioned, to teach you how to be an adult and think and live life and solve problems. To be honest, have I learned a lot of hard skills that I use in today's world? A few, but not as many as they advertise to you.
And Robby, being a racing driver, right? You're pursuing this simultaneously while going to college.
And it helped connect my passion to racing, and I think the intricacies of engineering and all that kind of stuff taught me to be very analytical, and I always have been very analytical, which totally connects to the real world and setting up a race car and understanding the systems on the car. I do a lot of coaching, so data acquisition, knowing how electronics work, and just maybe how to diagnose as a driver what's kind of going wrong with the car if there is something. It's one thing to say it's broken. It's one thing to say I think this is broken, type of thing. So yeah, for me, mechanical engineering was a way to connect my love for racing with my education. The practical knowledge is very transferable. Some of the theories, and you take these classes and do this math, and sometimes you're trying to see the light at the end of the tunnel thinking, when am I ever going to use this? But that's part of the process. So I'm still going to school actively online because racing has taken off so much I couldn't go to school in person anymore. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question of, I mean, for me it was, I don't think I'd be where I am without that minor foundation, and I met a lot of people and made a lot of connections in doing that. So I don't regret it at all, even though I'm quite a few years down the road and still don't have a degree, just because it's taken me a bit longer with my travel schedule, etc. But yeah, definitely a big part of my life.
Just make it clear for those listening on the audio version, slight internet hiccup there, so about 10 or seconds of Robby's answer got cut off. But no, I think you very much illustrated that, why it was important. Kind of then a follow-up question here is, obviously you're still recovering from a very traumatic injury. In 2016, what's the situation with your leg right now? I know when you first jumped into cars with clutches, you did need a little bit of an assistance in terms of a brace to help you, but how much have you managed to recover, and what type of limitations are you having to deal with now?
Yeah, so there's a few complications to that. When I was playing football, I was in very good physical shape. And then when I got hurt, I didn't move I was moving, but I basically spent a year on a couch or on basically bedridden. So I gained something like 90 pounds, and I was, quite heavy, which when you're recovering from a leg injury, also adding weight to your own body is not the way you want to do it. So I became very overweight, and I was basically struggling with that and the fact that, I was just starting to walk again. The thing that was tough was I had severe nerve damage and foot drop, so I had to relearn how to walk in a way, and all my muscles atrophied where they basically shut down. So you're trying to go to rehab to fire these muscles up, and you're trying to walk and you're trying to do all this stuff. But I was also putting extra added stress on my body because of the weight that I'd gained. So I was physically struggling, and to be honest, racing was a great escape from that. It's me and the car at the time. I was doing sprint type racing, and all the cars were identical. So it was a great escape for me to focus elsewhere. Basically, Monday through Friday until I was racing, everything was about my leg and how much it hurt and how heavy I was getting. And it was a tough time in my life. Something that I look back on and I'm glad I experienced, because it teaches you a lot about yourself, and it teaches you a lot about how to work hard, and it really basically drives home that, things in life that you really want, you have to earn, and, things aren't given to you easily. And that helped me motivate myself every day to lose weight, get better, try to improve my driving. And basically I became obsessive about just trying to get better. So there's a couple of different factors that all kind of attributed to, in 2016 I was racing, but I was not in the best physical shape, just in a lot of pain all the time, still trying to get used to my new leg, basically, that I was living with.
Honestly, it may seem like on the surface it's given you a very good lesson that to many may seem like, it's just basic knowledge, like we know this, but just to go in there to experience it for yourself, all the hard work and the effort, it's seriously come out so well towards the end, Robby. And in college, I was a bit curious about this one. There's always that certain charm with being a racing driver, right? Even though if it's a mechanical engineering course, there's always that certain X factor that it got. Did it feel anything special? Just to go in college when you were there and just to introduce people like, hi, I'm Robby and I'm a race car driver. Did it have that extra charm for you back in the day?
Probably helps with girls a little bit.
Well, surprisingly, I don't think as much as it may have in previous generations. Like, it's something that I try to help with. And long story short, I don't think a lot of people my age were really, especially that I grew up with, into racing. So now more and more of my friends understand and they get it. But I think within engineering and within the Formula SAE team initially, it's something cool. And people, especially in Alabama, NASCAR is a big thing where I went to school. So they didn't quite understand my kind of racing and the more intricate type of cars and just different technologies and stuff and the kind of racing we did. But I think it was definitely a cool experience. What was difficult was I was not at school very much in a social way because I was always racing. So I would go to class during the week, try to get as much work done as I could. Then I would go off racing. So during the weekend, I wasn't there. I had friends, a good group of friends, but I wasn't socializing as much as maybe the typical college student. So in that sense, maybe I didn't get quite the same college experience that a lot of people do, but that was just my situation, and I wouldn't change it for sure.
Robby, speaking of which, you mentioned that you were often racing. You're not really there in a social perspective. Talking about just the sacrifices to be a big racing driver of sorts, it must be a bit hard to comprehend, right? At that particular moment, a bit agitation, like, oh man, I'm not able to go out to the parties or meet my friends when I really want to. Did that really set in for you at a time?
Like you certainly, especially through the bad times or through times you're not seeing a lot of success as much as you want, you question like, am I really doing the right thing here? Am I missing out on an experience I'll never get to have again? But those thoughts were few and far between. I really knew that I wanted to pursue this, and if I didn't put 100% of my maximum effort in, I would be pretty upset at myself. So every now and then you're questioning, when you have a bad race or your future is unknown with if you're going to have funding to go to the next level, or you're on the back foot in the championship, you need to make up some ground. Like for me, I always had to finish in Skip Barber in a certain position in the championship to basically be funded for the next year. So like if you finished third, you would get some money. If you finished second, they would pay for you to race at the same level. And if you won, you would go to the next level. So for me, I had to always finish in the top 3 in the championship or I was basically screwed. So there was a lot of pressure, and I mostly put that on myself. My parents weren't saying like, oh, you have to win, otherwise you're a failure. Like I never received any of that kind of stuff. And honestly, I wasn't, my parents were very supportive, but I never received a lot of pressure. Like all the pressure came from me. I never had a dad that was on the side of the track yelling if I was not doing well. So it was all from myself. So just in that time in my life, I was also very young as well. So you're a young kid trying to mature as an adult. And I think that makes you mature earlier, but you're still a kid, right? So you're still learning about life and how to solve problems. And, sometimes your problem that you think is the end of the world on a given day is really not that big of a deal. So, I think the whole experience through college and racing initially just taught me how to be a bit more of an adult. And that helped me in a lot of ways advance my career, for sure.
Well, it is funny you mentioned your dad there, because my next question was going to be not about your dad, but about someone who I think might have been a big mentor over the last couple of years. Because as you make this transition, you talk about needing to, top 3 finishes in these Skip Barber regional championships to continue moving yourself forward. 2018, Big step forward. You now find yourself driving for Turner Motorsports. It doesn't get much bigger than that. And you've got the added pressure, if you ask me personally, of a legend as a teammate, Bill Auberlen, who is the most winningest sports car driver in America, I think, at this point, right? So what was that like for you? And given that your dad was such a mentor in, your early years, is Bill someone who you really looked up to and used over the last, 3-4 years as a teammate to build yourself up even further?
Yeah, absolutely. And the strange part of that is going back to something we spoke about earlier. I was that kid at 8 years old watching races, basically watching Bill Auberlen race, and then, basically in the blink of an eye, what it feels like in 2018, you're now his teammate. So quickly you realize, there's definitely some pressure. There's some, newfound hype around you and attention that I never really received previously too much. There's a lot more eyes on you. There's a lot more fans interacting with you. It's a very different experience from what I was doing previously. So I guess that's a intro to it. But yeah, to answer your question, Bill has been just a great resource for me, and just learning how he goes through a race weekend, and how he's basically achieved his success. It's very easy to see day in and day out how obsessive he is about winning, making the car better, faster. I mean, it's a 24/7, 365 effort to win races at his level. So back in 2018, I was very green. I had really barely driven GT cars. I had done the Rolex 24 once, actually in 2018 with the previous team I drove for in LMP3. But I didn't understand. Well, I did understand, but I didn't quite know what I didn't know in certain areas. So he was a great resource to help basically with my initial education about the little ins and outs of racing that you just don't necessarily think of or realize until you do them, until you get there. You don't know what you don't know until you're doing it. So having him as a teammate, I think, definitely allowed me to get to a competitive position quicker. When you first go into a new category, it's always difficult to be competitive right away. But I think by the end of that year in 2018, definitely the pace was there. Just needed to execute on the little things. And then since then, in 2019, things really started to click. And then, you're running at the front. And I think that's a credit to many people, Bill being one of them, just being a great teammate. He's a great guy. We've grown a great relationship. So now he's my teammate and friend. And before, when I was 10 years old, he was Bill Auberlen, the famous sports car racing driver. So it's a bit of an interesting journey where you blink and then you're in a totally different position and you're like, how did I end up here? But yeah, it's been cool.
And it really has been a meteoric rise, because that first year, highest place finish, I think, was 4th at Road America. The next year, 2nd in the standings, race winner at the Canadian Tire Motorsports Park. I had the abbreviation down on my notes, always confuses me. 2nd at Petit Le Mans as well, in a very, very close race. 2020, you became the SRO GT4 America's champion alongside current teammate Michael Deenan in SRO GT3. Also victory in a couple of races there. 5th place in the championship. 3 race victories in the IMSA Michelin Pilot Challenge as well. And now you enter 2021 with an even bigger slate of schedule, because you've got these 3 major competitions: SRO GT3, the IMSA entire season, and the Michelin Pilot season as well. Yeah. Can you talk to me a bit about balancing that schedule? Because I don't think necessarily the cars are that different. GT3, GT4 is maybe a slightly easier transition than someone like Ben Keating doing LMP2 to GT3. But it must just be busy for you. All the traveling around, testing as well. There's very limited test days, so the sim time becomes very important as well. What's it like for you trying to make sure that you don't get burnt out over a very long year?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult. And to be honest, last year, in the end, it was very tough with COVID and just having back-to-back. I think the internet dropped. Hopefully it's back. Just every single weekend last year I was racing back-to-back after we had a bit of a lockdown period, which was difficult on your body and everything like that. But headed into this year, as you say, I have the similar schedule with about all in something like high 20s in race weekends. Then you add in testing, you add in traveling, you try to see your family, you try to see your girlfriend, you try to do all this stuff, and your schedule is completely packed, which is good. I wouldn't have it any other way, but it definitely wears on you with your physical fitness and what you're eating and how much you're sleeping. It all adds up. So I guess to connect that to sim racing, I do do a lot of practice and prep on the sim, just the next track I'm going to go to, a new track I'm driving, and that helps me a lot. If I don't get to drive as much as I want pre-event there in real life, we're lucky to do an SRO, a lot of testing this year, which will be great. And I know very well the GTD M6 on the Michelin tire, so that's all good. This year is really just about kind of keeping myself fresh as much as possible. And yeah, I've learned that through the years. Like 2019 was the first year I did the double kind of duty with multiple series and 3 series off and on, and it's great. It's a dream situation, but it definitely can take a toll on you, and it's important to keep fit and just not run yourself down actively, because you don't want to get burnt out and ultimately cost yourself some performance in the car.
And I think that burnout challenge is something that sim racers as well have to deal with, right? That in sim racing,
Absolutely.
There's never an off week. There's always stuff going on. And let's dive into the sim stuff then, because Zebring, let's talk about it. We've been focusing on the real world stuff. And over the last couple of weeks, the Zebras have been calling. They've been talking about this charge down to Sebring that they're going to do. And it's amazing. You've been part of BS Competition and Turner Motorsports, and now they're going to join forces. We'll get into the details in just a few minutes' time, but can you talk to us, Robby, about what it means for you, someone who really has, like Soumil mentioned, I think at the start of the broadcast, this first generation of race car drivers growing up in the sim racing age. What's it like for you to be able to represent a sim team and a real-life professional motorsports organization?
Yeah, it's awesome. And I guess as a little bit of an intro, I grew up around sim racing. I played a lot of racing video games, Gran Turismo 4 on PlayStation. I had a little wheel. I was always driving. I was trying to drive when I was 8, 9 years old on racetracks. I've known the Nürburgring, the layout of the Nordschleife, since I was like 9 years old. Obviously, I've recently done a lot more of it on iRacing and found out that I have some improvement to make, but I've known where to turn left and right there since I was about 10. So yeah, for me, it was always the way that I would race. I would watch a race on TV, then I would go downstairs and play on my PlayStation, and that was my reality. So it started at a very early age, and I think I developed some skills just in car control or whatever, not to spin the car or whatever from an early age, doing that combined with the autocrossing I did in go-karts. And to bring that full circle, I never really did sim racing on an esports type level. It was always for fun and always something I did in conjunction with my racing, until I sort of joined with BS Competition recently through kind of like the IMSA Pro Series that was going on during the quarantine lockdown last year. And basically I was racing a Turner BMW virtually, and BS Competition was supporting the BMW drivers in the IMSA series, and started to have a great relationship with some guys on the team. And yeah, it was just a great partnership that I was really enjoying. And there was an opportunity to join the team on a more official basis. Story short, since then, we've been collaborating and trying to basically connect the two worlds, real world and virtual, because ultimately we all love racing, whatever it is, virtual, real racing, and the two worlds definitely collide. And that's been something that we've been we've been taking our real world liveries and putting them in iRacing, and you guys have seen that with, Turner cars running in IMSA, Turner cars and BS cars running together. But something really cool that we don't think's ever been done that we want to do is take a sim racing livery and put it in the real world. So that's what all this hype has been about. I guess here we're breaking the news, right? But that's what the hype's been about. We're going to have on our GS car, there it is, at Sebring, our M4 GT4, we race in the Michelin Pilot Challenge. We're going to have a half Turner Motorsport livery as we race it at Daytona, and a half traditional BS Competition livery that you guys have seen in all the biggest sim racing events in the world. So it's a really cool initiative, and I have to credit Florian at BS Competition for the idea initially. I think it's something that was in front of our face for quite a long time, but he said, hey, why don't we do this? And I think it's great. It connects his passion for racing with Will Turner's passion for racing, and for me to be a part of it on both sides is really humbling. I get to race with all my friends at BS Competition, during the week and on the weekends, and then also race with Will Turner and Turner Motorsport in the real world. So it's a dream situation. I wouldn't have thought it was possible, but when you take two people at owning these two companies, their passion, and you connect these two, some cool stuff happens. So we've had some stuff going on behind the scenes with the famous crotch belt, who's been active, who shall not be named, the Turner Motorsport social media accounts. And I think what's cool about this is BS Competition and Turner Motorsport share the same passion, but they also share the same humor. We're very serious about racing, right? We want to win, we want to be the best, but it's never dry and it's never boring. I think if you see the Twitter action, it's always there's always jokes flying around and cool stuff. So I think it's a great way for us, if I'm putting my real world driver hat on, it's a great way for us to give back to the sim racing community, and show our appreciation for sim racers, game developers, hardware manufacturers, everybody that's involved with virtual racing. We're going to show that off in the real world, where previously we've been showing off the real world in the sim racing community. So, and for me personally, to be able to represent both worlds, obviously I would call myself predominantly first a real world driver, that kind of joined in the sim racing community more officially, seriously recently. It's great to represent both worlds on one car, and I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to create some hype. It's going to be interesting, and hopefully it sparks some interest from both sides.
Well, and hopefully we get to do it more in the future as well, because I know Florian is slightly disappointed. He was trying to figure out how to make the trip from Germany to Florida, as was I, and I was looking forward to getting to see that in person as well. But it's not just Turner and BS Competition. It's IMSA, it's Sebring. There's so many people involved in this as well. It is such a great thing to see the world's coming together. One big community is what the Crotch Belt told me last night when we spoke. And it really is about, just like for the last 20 years, we've had sim racers jumping into the sim after a race weekend, throwing on the paint schemes of their idols, pretending to be their idols and reliving those moments. Now it's about flipping it around, paying tribute to all of the community and the hard work that gets done. A shout out to Andy Blackmore and iLiveries, because it's a combo designed across the two of them. You get the best of the sim world and the best in the real world as well. It'll be great to see that out on track and Sebring. And how long is the race, Robbie? Because hopefully we'll get to see you win another one of these Michelin Pilot races again.
Yeah, so it's I guess one quick thing too that you bring up that was interesting is I used to be that kid that would watch the real world race and then go play on my sports. But to answer your question, it's a 2-hour race at Sebring, and one that we actually won last time out. So we know the way to victory lane there. We just have to execute again. I think we'll have a very good car. We know our M4 GT4 there very well, and Turner always gives us the best BMW possible. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to sharing the car again with Vin. And we had a nice podium at Daytona. And hopefully we can follow it up with a good result at Sebring and bring the zebras to victory lane in the real world.
Yeah, mirror that as well. Let's start talking about the sim stuff as well then, because I think there's a real opportunity with someone who's really engrossed yourself in the community to talk about this. You're a driving coach in the real world as well, and part of that does come into your driving responsibilities, where you share a car with someone that you're coaching. I want to try and get your understanding here, because obviously you see what it takes for very talented drivers, slightly older in the real world, to come in and get up to speed in a very new environment. Yeah. Then you take a sim racer who's got years and years and hours of practice on the sim world. But if you ask me, there's one factor that you can never quantify, and that's the risk versus reward. How much are you willing to go deep under the brakes? For you, as a coach, what would be the first thing that you would try and get someone who's transitioning to really understand? Because I think that's a big transition that we're slowly seeing more and more sim racers trying to get these opportunities to be able to do this.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is all physical feel, right? So in a sim, you have less sensory input. You have a very good steering wheel. Like I've got a nice sim setup back there with a powerful steering motor and good feel on the pedals. But that's all you're getting. In real life, it's much more physical, especially the faster the car you drive, the harder you're working, the more physical it is. You feel G-forces, you feel it's a much more taxing environment, and it's much more violent in a way, especially at Sebring with all the bumps, and you feel every one of those bumps. So I would say the physical side of it is one thing, and then the fear factor or the risk versus reward, just the sheer reality of it is in iRacing, if you have a crash in a race, obviously your race is done, but there's very likely no physical harm to you at all. Or you're not tearing up millions of dollars worth of equipment, or hurting somebody else or wrecking somebody else's race. So from that perspective, there's less on the line. There's not less on the line in terms of competition. Obviously, the competition is just as fierce, and there is a lot on the line in that sense. Money, pride, sponsorship. It's that part of it's the same, but you don't experience the I don't know if fear is the right word, because at a top level in real racing, you don't have a lot of fear. You're calculated and you understand the risk, but there's much more risk. In sim racing, it's really easy to go out on your first lap and brake very deep into a corner, but in real life, you think about it a bit more, and it's a bit more of a commitment. So I would say just keeping that in check, and somebody that's coming from the sim world to the real world, you have to learn to manage risk a bit differently, I think, if that makes sense. And yeah, that's something in the coaching I do, even in the real world, that's generally people initially are going to be too timid and too overly cautious. It's something to overcome, I think. And a lot of people that go from sim racing to real racing, their first couple of times they experience a real car, especially something on the limit, driving really hard, or a fast car, they're a bit more gun shy, I guess is a good way to say it.
Probably speaking of the transition between real world to sim racing, obviously iRacing is doing their best to make sure that the cars are as realistic as they possibly can be. I mean, you can shed a bit of light upon the M4 a little bit later, but the thing is, in modern days, I've heard lots of teaching schools for racing. They've started to use sim racing as a very good tool to teach the young drivers about how you can do it, at least for the basics. What's your opinion on that stuff? Do you think it can act as a very good tool, at least to learn? Or do you still think that the physical sensations and the other stuff, they're far too crucial, so mostly drivers should spend more time on the track than on the sim?
Absolutely a good tool, and it's one that I still personally use to get better. I think the strongest or the biggest factor is in sim racing, you have to be extremely mentally tough, and that's something that has helped me just in executing for an hour straight on the sim, where you're not you have to really stay on top of your mind, because you're not feeling all these forces. In a race car, I think it's easier to focus in real life, because if you don't focus, you're off the track or you're going to have a crash, and you have adrenaline in real life. But in sim racing, you're looking at screens and it's very intense, but you have to almost control your mind more, I think. And that's something that I remember even in the off season, just doing official races on iRacing in the top splits, trying to win these races, and a little mistake, losing 2/10, you lose a position, and then you're already on the back foot. So I think it's first of all great for that. Also, the techniques that you use, in a general sense, the fundamentals are very similar. How you brake and how you trail off the brake is fairly similar. How you apply the throttle, the theories that you're using, the lines that you would take, the general physics of the sim is very good. It's as good as we have really at our fingertips, but it's hard to have the same feeling because you're not feeling the real car. But generally, why you would do what you do and why you do it is very much the same. So I use it actually like to coach some drivers that I coach in real life. Just looking at data, we have the ability these days to look at data from the sim and do the same kind of review that I would do in real life and pick apart the different driving styles and what they're doing wrong, what they're doing right, and then try to transfer that to the real car. And I honestly use that a lot myself, especially when I was growing up. Like in the 2016 timeframe, especially then, I was basically driving 6 times a year because there was only 6 races and I couldn't afford testing. So I had to teach myself basically why I was going to brake this way, how I was going to trail off the brake, what that did to rotate the car, all this kind of stuff. I really think I learned on the sim. I never really actively thought about it as I was doing it, but as I look back now, I think I learned a lot more from it than I actually realized and gave credit to at the time, because I didn't. Nothing supplements real seat time in a real race car if you're actually racing, but with the limited, well, really no testing that I did in that period of time, I relied heavily on iRacing, and especially at the time I was driving a Mazda MX-5 and they had a Mazda MX-5, so I could tell. Let's say I was going to Sebring for the first time, I would know what gear to be in where. I would, know certain things straight off the bat, which was extremely helpful, and I think gave me maybe an edge over those who weren't using the same tools I was.
Now, the MX-5 iRacing have just nailed it with the MX-5. So many people have come up and said it's just so realistic on the service. But what's your take about the M4, Robbie? It's recently come up on the iRacing service, relatively of sorts. It's not been over a year for that one. Well, what do you reckon? What's the transition like for you when you drive it on the sim and when you drive it in the real life? Any major differences that you feel as such?
Well, I guess to start off with, I was lucky enough to help iRacing with the car. They actually scanned our car at Turner Motorsport.
Nice.
Because, as you guys know, iRacing is in Boston and Turner Motorsport is in Massachusetts near Boston. So and I think the same was the case with the Z4 GT3, but that was before my time at Turner. They came and scanned the car, and I was able to help them develop it a little bit. There's some differences for sure. I think a lot of it is in sim racing, you can take advantage a little bit more of the fact that you're in a virtual environment. Like, to get lap time out of it, you can adjust the setup in ways that we wouldn't be able to in real life. But in general, it's very good and very accurate. And I think, everybody at iRacing did a nice job in basically taking feedback. What I did, I guess candidly, was I took some data that I had from real life and I overlaid it with the M4 and iRacing when I was testing for them prior to it being released. And we were just trying to match everything that we could. Eventually, we did get something that was very good. And then they had to sort of match it to the other GT4 car, which was the Porsche at the time. So it's a very realistic and good representation. For me personally, when I get into it in iRacing, I overdrive it a little bit, but it's very good. It's very realistic in every way. The gearing is exactly accurate. They have the physical model of the car. Everything looks correct. It's kind of crazy, and even down to, like, I was actually looking at this the other day in a replay file that I was looking at, like the camera position of our in-car camera. I was looking at it from like an angle, sort of looking at the driver, and the camera is in like the exact position it is in our car. It was quite funny. So they literally scanned this thing to be identical. You don't miss a single feature. So that's really quite cool. And to have your own car in iRacing that, all these users and all these sim racing fans and real racing fans are driving is something really cool. And the livery, the actual Turner Motorsport livery, came out with the car. So when it was first released on the service, I remember going and driving, and just it was like week 13. I was just driving in a fun session, and like 10 people are driving the car, messaging me, saying how cool it is to drive the real car. It was quite a cool experience. So, yeah, I guess long story short about the car itself, I think it's very good and accurate. To get the most out of the lap time in the sim, you're taking advantage of things that would be a little bit too on edge in real life, which is probably the case. And it doesn't make it less realistic, but maybe it does slightly, but it's because of the fact you can drive the car more on the limit, on the edge, in the sim without the same consequence, because you ultimately can just hit reset if you have a crash. But the car is very, very good.
Well, consequence is a good way to kind of segue to our final topic here, because we kind of want to try and just have a little bit of roundup here, Robbie, about what you think the future holds in this ever-blurring world between virtual and real motorsports. Because recently announced that the IGTC is going to have sim races that accompany the real races, and those sim races will award points for the overall championship. Can you give us your overall thoughts here? Because my initial impression is this is going to help certain teams out, where maybe in a case like yours, you've got a lot of sim experience, a lot of experience in the real world as well. I don't see why you would not be the prime target for a lot of these teams that now need and want a strong sim driver and a strong real driver to make sure you maximize your points chances in that competition.
Yeah, I think it's cool, and I think the same as with Zebring and our initiative, you'll see the worlds colliding a little bit more. I think there's really endless opportunities, and it's something that I'm passionate about and always thinking about and wanting to work on for the future. And I think the more, as the world goes more and more virtual, or as there's more technology at our fingertips, even since, I'm 24 now, if I look back to when I was 14, there's so much more technology, there's so much more technology at your fingertips that was sort of unimaginable back then, which I think for society is both good and bad, but for us as sim racers and sim racing fans, it's all good for us. We can see the good, not necessarily all of the bad. But in the future, as technologies and software and these services like iRacing keep getting more and more advanced, I think you're going to see the ability for the two worlds to collide a bit more. I think it's going to be very, very difficult in any future form of motorsport to completely replicate what it's like to drive a race car in the real world. I feel very lucky to be able to experience what that feels like, but it's really, it's unlike anything else. You're basically riding a roller coaster, but you're in control of it, and the feeling you get from the car and when you're, sending it for a qualifying lap is something that I find really hard to replicate in any form of, life. It's just exciting, and it's a cool feeling. Can we get that out of sim racing? I don't know, maybe in the future, but that sheer physical feeling you get from the real car is going to be hard to replicate. But everything else is very easily transferred. So I think hopefully, we're on the trend setting side of it, but I think you're going to see a lot more collaboration. I think there's a lot of people in the esports community that we'd definitely like to draw towards being interested in racing in general. So I think in the future, the two worlds will definitely continue to meet. They'll never be the same, but I think there's so many parallels that it would be silly to not continue to see this basically coming together of the two worlds.
Robbie, you mentioned an excellent point over there, about more information everywhere. It's been a case around the world in different elements and different walks of life that information is just being available also amazingly and also easily. Is there ever a point of information failure for a racing driver? Like whether there's like too much information for you and there's too much information that actually gets into your mind that ends up making you feel a bit distracted. Have you ever faced a scenario like that, say in the sim or maybe in the real life, that you're worried about the every last thing, about the suspension angles or whatever, about the camber of the wheels? Does it ever feel like, it should be just so simple, I just want to get out there and drive? Is that your thought process by any way whatsoever?
Yeah, it's good. It's interesting you pick up on that because that's actually a very large part of what I deal with as a coach and as a driver. Like everybody that I work with is different. Some people you just need to tell them where to brake and what to do, and they'll do it. Some people need to understand why and how. Everybody's a bit different in how they analyze, but too much information is definitely not good. I know I've driven with people that are on both ends of the spectrum that are too seat of the pants, I call it, where they're just driving by feel and they don't think about enough, okay, what am I actually doing here? And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have drivers that are totally hindered by the fact that they're overly consumed by how to be better, and they really just need to get in and drive and use. They're thinking about it too much, basically. I think the same is correct in the sim world, especially, and I do this often too when I'm like trying to compete with my really talented sim racing teammates, especially if I've been off the sim for a while. I'll get on and I'll be off the pace and I'll be like, okay, and then I overanalyze the data a little bit too much, and when I'm driving, I try to emulate that in the data, when in reality, I just need more laps, and I'm going to find a 10th here or a 10th there if I just do more laps. And I'm going to hone in my own skill, my own craft, and my own technique. So it's certainly a balance, and I've definitely recently experienced, the extremes of both, and not thinking about it enough, and definitely overthinking it. So it's a great balance, and I think that's something, especially when you talk about sim racing and you talk about the mental aspect of it, I think it's almost a bigger thing in sim racing. I've honestly, when I've qualified for these big sim racing events, you're almost more nervous on the sim than you are in real life. In the IMSA Pro Series, I got the first pole position at Sebring, and I remember after I'm like literally shaking, and I'm in the real car, I'm very calm, and I'm very I was still calm on the sim, whatever, but you can easily your mind can easily just be lost in what's happening, and you're so focused, and every little inch matters of place the car here, don't hit the wall, but get right up next to it. Like turn 1 at Sebring in the M8 on the lap that I did was just like, I almost couldn't do it again, just how close I was to the wall. I thought I hit the wall, but I didn't, and then I had to focus on the fact that I didn't hit the wall. This mental preparation is it's unlike anything else, I think, especially when you're competing at the top level. The great series that we see now running across all the platforms, especially iRacing with Pesk and others. I have some friends that are doing that, and a teammate Mick O'Gade on BS Competition who's doing it. Like, the respect I have for these guys is a lot. Like the prep they put in, the hours, the sheer ability to execute. Like they're driving really well in the sim, and they're also really very, very mentally strong. And you definitely see people colliding, and there's emotions and whatever, just like real racing, but they're definitely high caliber. They're people that know how to perform at a very high level, which is impressive and something I've always respected in all forms of sport.
Well, Robby, final question before we wrap up then. I've really enjoyed this chat a lot, but one thing that I think is very interesting is there's a new era of GT3 machines on the way, and while the M6 has been a very, very long-serving servant for Turner Motorsports, the M4 GT3 is right on the horizon. Have you had the chance to drive it in the real world yet, or is all of your testing being done just on the sim right now?
Yeah, not yet in the real world, hopefully soon. But yeah, I have driven it on iRacing quite a lot, and yeah, enjoying it and getting used to just what maybe it'll be like in real life. Definitely looking forward to hopefully getting a chance to test it soon. But yeah, it's really cool, and I think, to be honest, like I can't think of a car that was released on iRacing before it was actually in competition in the real world. I could be wrong, but yeah, it's quite cool. And you see with BMW taking a larger interest in sim racing, the steering wheel in partnership with Fanatec is the exact same. So you can literally take the car from the wheel from the GT3, plug it on your sim, and yeah, you're good to go, which is really cool and something I'm looking forward to, because hopefully I get to drive the new car, and if I do, I'll be very in tune with where the buttons are from my sim driving. So I think that's really quite cool. We've seen that, a little bit. People always trying to copy real world steering wheels, but to actually literally have the same wheel that is exactly the same is really cool. So looking forward to that, and yeah, looking forward to hopefully getting my hands on it soon.
And again, thanks for joining us, Robby. Looking forward to catching Turner Motorsports in action then in just over a week's time, live at the 12 Hours of Sebring. But for now, it's time to wrap up another episode of Talking Tent. Before we go, let's preview the upcoming weekend of action on RaceSpot TV. Relatively quiet. Last week we had an incredible 15 different events. This time, just 2 on the weekend. Looking forward to getting some well-needed sleep. First on Saturday, we head to upstate New York for the 6 hours of Watkins Glen, presented by Turner Motorsports. German coverage begins at 3 p.m. UTC live on RaceSpot TV's YouTube. The next day, we will have coverage of the European Digital Motorsports Cup and the Race of Nations at 11 a.m. UTC. For now, though, for the entire team at RaceSpot TV, my name is Arjuna Kankipati. I've been joined by the wonderful Soumil Arora, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time for more Talking Tents.